the request to accept that we are recording, so please click on OK. And that's it from my side. It's my pleasure to welcome the editor of the book, Professor Jakub Bijak from the University of Southampton, as our main speaker today. Jakub, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on this December morning or afternoon. My great pleasure to introduce the book. The proper title is From Uncertainty to Policy: A Guide to Migration Scenarios. It's been a product of a research project that we started back in 2020 called QuantMe, Quantifying Migration Scenarios for Better Policy, and the book is the final product and something that the whole team put together as a testament to all the work we did. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this launch event on International Migrants Day this year, and I would like you to start by taking you through the book just in a few slides before giving the voice to an esteemed panel of experts whom I'll introduce in a minute. But before, what the book is about, why is it worth reading, regardless of whether you're an academic or a policymaker or an advisor. So in the book, we are trying to make three main points, three big ideas. First, we focus on the idea of uncertainty, and uncertainty in migration, we argue, is a feature, not a bug. It's central to the processes that we observed in the migration realm. The second idea is that given that uncertainty and also given the complexity of migration processes, whenever we talk about scenarios of migration for the future, whenever we talk about preparedness for future migration events, this thinking has to have uncertainty at its core. And thirdly, because all of that, the process of building migration scenarios is an ongoing one. It's a continuous learning exercise. It's not something that can be done in one instance and then put on a shelf. It's something that ideally should be an ongoing learning endeavor. So I'll take you through the different parts of the book, so to give you a flavor of what's inside, starting from the uncertain concepts underpinning migration. And these are, as I've mentioned already, uncertainty and complexity, which we see as the key features of migration processes. And the question we're asking is, what do we know about migration processes, but also what can be known? What are the limits of knowledge? What are the things that we can potentially, with more research, greater investment in data collection, find out about, and what will be ever beyond the reach of today's knowledge about migration? And quite frankly, a lot of the future migration is in the unknown and unknowable realm. So what can we do? If we know at least something, we can plan. But if we know only a little, we can prepare. And the choice between these two options will guide the choice of analytical tools that we can use to make statements and also to help us make decisions about concerning future migration. You may ask, what about drivers? What about the processes that are underlying migration? And what is not a surprise to anyone looking at migration analytically, there are many drivers of migration. These drivers interact in very complex ways. And the way these drivers act is very context specific. This makes using the drivers directly in scenario setting very difficult. Of course, there are other frameworks, other theoretical frameworks that can come very handy for looking at migration scenarios, such as the aspirations and capabilities framework. People aspire to have better life, safer life, and they may or may not have the capabilities to do that through migration. But all of that is very complex. And when we try to put this in practice, it turns out that for doing this systematically in the context of migration scenarios, the complexity is far too large to enable useful reasoning on that basis. But there are still some lessons that can be learned. The composition of flows matters. The fact that we can look at study migration, labor migration, family migration separately, asylum migration as a separate category, that we can look at different directions of flows for people at different education levels or with different sets of skills. This matters because this helps us make the scenarios more fine-tuned and more better tailored for the specific needs. What about the data? I think, especially in Europe, we now reach the stage where at least we know what we don't know. There is quite a lot of evidence already behind the data, European migration data quality, availability. And our work, as we argue through in the book, talks about trade-offs, and especially a trade-off between data accuracy and availability. And our argument is that sometimes it's better to have data that are of poorer quality, as long as we know what the problems with these data are, than not to have any data at all. So sometimes the perfect is the enemy of the good in that context. But what can we do to help make conclusions as robust as we can based on the data that we have is at least to acknowledge the errors. We argue for using probabilistic methods, which come with error bounds, with error measures as a default. But the bottom line is that whatever measures we come up with need to reflect this uncertain migration reality. What about scenarios then? I think it doesn't come as a surprise, especially going back to the concepts, to the known and unknown, or knowable and unknowable sources of uncertainty. The time horizon for which we're making our statements about future migration matters a lot. It's a completely different story whether we are talking about nowcasting, whether we are talking about early warnings, about things that are processes that are already happening, versus charting scenarios over decades to come. And what we propose in the book, and what we also illustrate by showing the impacts of different migration scenarios for the population and labor force projections over the coming decades in the long term, is an approach that's based on the frequency and magnitude of uncertain events. So rather than creating our scenarios based on drivers and trying to build them by putting different driver combinations together, which as we've argued is too complex, we are trying to look at the past series of data and see which kinds of migration events were happening with what frequencies, and then extrapolate these frequencies into the future. This approach additionally helps with planning. This approach additionally helps making contingency plans for different eventualities, which is part of the appeal of this approach. It's a pragmatic solution, but it's one that speaks to the needs of the users of the scenarios. So now, when it comes to the users themselves, the challenge, of course, is communicating all this complexity and uncertainty in such a way that it becomes part of the language in which both the producers and the users of the scenarios speak. So this is really a call which we make in the book for a dialogue between science and policy, and for establishing mechanisms for exchanging knowledge between the different groups by design rather than by accident or as an afterthought. Of course, there are important prerequisites for that. Honesty and trust. The producers of scenarios have to be honest about the magnitude of errors, about the things that we don't know, about the things that we won't ever be able to know. And at the same time, there needs to be a trust that what is being produced is of the highest quality and doesn't speak to any hidden agenda. What is also something that comes up very strongly from the different parts of the book is the need for what is called data translation. professional data translators, someone who would take the results of the scenario making process of the estimates and then translate this into the language used for not only for the technical, civil service, international organizations, but also at the policymakers at the end of the day, is something that is lacking, and that is a direction where we think there's a lot of improvement to be made and a lot of progress to be made. So, what have we learned by working on this project and by writing the book? The 5 lessons, I would just summarize them here. Avoiding the illusions, avoiding the illusion of prediction, and avoiding the illusion of control. The illusion of prediction is something that sort of more on the producer side of scenarios. It's temptation to think that my scenarios will be more accurate than everyone else's. Which can backfire, and likewise on the user side is the control, right? The fact that we can control migration if we only implement the right policies. It doesn't work like that. It's not that simple. The second lesson is, given all the uncertainty, we cannot be complacent, but at the same time we do not have to and should not overreact to every slight change in the trend, to every slight change in the data. There may be a tendency, driven to some extent by the media, to really follow the current affairs at the very, very high speed, which doesn't necessarily help to see the big picture over the long time horizon. The third lesson is to use of all available knowledge. In this way, we can at least try to narrow down the scope of uncertainty that is clouding the migration processes now and in the future. And also, as Anne Singleton, one of the commenters in the book, makes an eloquent point about using indigenous knowledge in that context too, so knowledge of people with lived experiences of migration. The fourth point is future-proofing the scenarios by design. So whenever we come up with a scenario, whenever we come up with a forward-looking exercise, it has to have elements that would trigger automatic updates, either at regular intervals or whenever there is a change in circumstances. So the continuous learning has to be at the core. And the final point is, in the face of uncertainty, we are talking about processes that are really uncertain. We really can't predict every single detail of how a process would react to a policy intervention. What is fundamental is creating what's called a just culture, a culture that, unless there have been errors made, doesn't apportion blame, doesn't wave a finger at people, but rather uses what is happening to learn lessons for the future. So these are the 5 messages that we wanted to convey, that are included in the book. And for now, what I would like to do is to invite the panel of distinguished experts. It's my great pleasure to announce Professor Helga de Valk from the Netherlands Institute of the Interdisciplinary Demographic Institute, Dr. Mary McAuliffe from the head of the IOM International Organization for Migration Research Division, and Dr. Teddy Wilkin from the European Union Agency for Asylum. We're very grateful for accepting our invitation to speak at this panel, and we'd like to invite you to share your views about the possibility of looking into future migration processes. So may I start by asking a question to the panel? Why should we talk about future migration scenarios? We know about the uncertainty. We know about this is not only the central theme of the book. This is something that has been well documented time and again in the literature. But despite all of that, why do we care? Why should we look at the future? Can I start with Teddy, because you're the practitioner. You're sort of very close to the actual action when it comes to response based on future trends.
Yeah,
Why
certainly. Thanks very much, Jakub, and thanks for inviting me to join this this meeting and contributing to this book as well, which I think will be an extremely valuable contribution to our little area of work. So the question is, so I mean, why should we do it when there's so much uncertainty and forecasting migration is so hard, when there's quite a history of forecasters missing the target slightly when it comes to forecasting major global events like COVID-19, like Brexit, and like so many other nearby events to the European Union, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and so many big events which have had an impact on migration, which ultimately turned out to be quite unpredictable and took us all by surprise. I mean, I think it's always been important to think and plan for the future, and that hasn't changed. But what has changed in recent decades is that the world has become increasingly complex and increasingly certain. So we've got to work within that assumption. Probably most of our listeners have heard about Moore's law, which is about technology and technological developments that double every 2 years or so, with increasing complexity and lower cost. And this law can probably be applied to migration, or at least some parts of it, because opportunities for global travel have increased and the price has decreased over the last 20 years, while at the same time the world is becoming increasingly connected, increasingly complicated, and recently more full of conflicts. And so yes, there's a lot of uncertainty. And we've heard it said before that migration is a complex system. So for listeners that are unfamiliar with that term, imagine smoke filling a room. We couldn't predict exactly how that's going to happen, no matter how much data we had. So there are elements of unpredictability in a complex system, and that's the job ahead of us with trying to produce useful scenarios and forecasts when it comes to migration. But what scenarios do is they provide a sensible framework around which we can explore a range of possible futures and ways to manage them. So, on the practitioner side, we tend to grab senior decision makers and say, look, this is how the future is likely to contain several or many of these elements, and we need to start thinking about them now. So, I mean, it's not just an academic exercise, intellectual gymnastics, as they say. It's about dealing with real world events and, trying to support efficient planning. The mantra of turning challenges into opportunities, it's a real thing, but it's only possible if you do have your eye on the future. That's where I'd leave it for that question.
Thank you, Mary, because you sit in between of the two worlds, right? As a head of IOM research, you a civil servant, but at the same time an academic. How do you see that?
Well, and thank you again for the invitation to join and to be part of the panel. And congratulations, of course, on the book, and really enjoying that it's open access, which makes it so much more accessible to a whole range of different audiences, including policymakers. And you're right, Jakub, I definitely sort of straddle two different divides. I think when reading the book, and I have been sitting on planes, I must admit, in the last couple of weeks traveling around for different events, I have been reading the book and thinking more of my past life than my current life. My past life was as a senior policy advisor, used to run a very big research program on irregular migration for the Australian government, working in member state contexts, but working with academics to try and bring research and analysis on a very contested and very important topic into the policy and the political domain. So thinking about scenarios within a policy context, it's not sort of despite the vast uncertainty, it's because of the vast uncertainty that policymakers who deal with the problem end of the business, rather than trying to necessarily understand the nuances of the problem, trying to solve it, and implement policy and operational responses, that we see that lots of different types of techniques, including scenarios, a whole range of nowcasting, as you mentioned, hotspot analysis, so on, has really elevated in the last sort of 5 years because the levels of uncertainty have increased. The global transformations, which we talk about in the World Migration Report, around technological change, environmental change, including climate change, and the big one, geopolitics, which is deeply embedded within transnational processes such as migration, really mean that we are dealing with very high levels of uncertainty. For areas of policy that I've worked in previously that are much more certain, the natural tendency to try and plan and prepare, to try and enact some type of control, even if that is not about controlling the actual process, but controlling, you know, the regulatory environment or your operational and programmatic responses, is, I think, in so many ways inevitable. But one of the key things that I would really highlight is that migration is not migration. We talk about migration so often as an umbrella term, but it is very different depending on what policy categories you're looking at. If you're a policymaker, if you're working in the humanitarian sector, if you're working in the development sector, if you're in the international environment, it's really about populations who might be at risk of exploitation, abuse, human rights abuses, and so forth. So you are looking at very different constructs and manifestations of migration. And I would put that right across the spectrum of migration and displacement. The other aspect too that I think is really important to recall is that migration and migrants are conceptually linked, but they are quite distinct. So if we shine the light instead of on migration, and particularly migration flows, which is always the thing that people get drawn to, if we think about migrants and think about social cohesion, integration, what that means in terms of development back in origin countries, what that means in terms of protection of rights in transit countries, you come up with very different scenarios that are equally, arguably for some, more important than looking at the quantitative aspects and the flow dimensions. And I think that's a really important point, because we can talk about scenarios in terms of what values societies want. How do we then go about planning and preparing to reach those values in societies that embrace human rights, inclusivity, social cohesion, and so forth? So it's just those different kind of aspects, I think, that have come from probably both divides, the policy environment and also the international and the research environment, that came to mind when we're talking about uncertainty and how important scenario building is in migration.
Thank you. And Helga, because you are, you know, you're an academic, but also you're an advisor, and have served and are serving on multiple advisory bodies to the national government and the European Commission. What's your take on that?
Well, thanks a lot also for being part of this panel, and congratulations for having the book published on this International Migrants Day. I think it's very well placed that it's happening now, and it's really opening a good debate about these topics. And I think we should continue those exchanges and debates. Well, I think it's interesting that in the past, when we look decades ago, even centuries ago, life has always been uncertain. But I think in the current days, we think that we can control everything in life, and that we probably also should control everything in life. Well, that's an interesting take on things, because on many domains in life, things are uncertain, and not just in the field of migration. And we are thinking about how to deal with that uncertainty. And I think it also creates a lot of stress with people. It creates stress with policymakers. What should we do? And they want a vision on the world. And I think in general, there is no one solution or one vision. And I think scenarios really come in to show that, but also to think beyond our problems of today and how they should be solved, but to really think creatively about the problems and the issues we have to deal with in the future. Because what I often see in policy making, but also in us as academics, we try to answer the issues that we are facing today, and we try to tackle them not thinking about what would be probably the future look like and what are the issues that come up probably tomorrow or in a decade or in a few decades. And I think scenarios really allow to think along different ways and be prepared for different routes that may arise. For example, the pandemic, it was already mentioned, we were not prepared, but this was because people were not listening to scenario makers in that field who already predicted that this was coming at some point and the scenarios that would potentially be relevant in that case. And I think the book clearly shows that scenarios can be a good way of preparing mentally, not only with action, but also mentally what could happen in the future. And they also allow to think out of the box and to make scenarios that probably in our current thinking are totally outrageous and don't seem valuable at all. But that may actually happen in a decade or 2 decades. And then it's useful to already have thought through the consequences. So I think that is one of the main things that scenarios can bring us also in academic thinking. They are not just migration scenarios, are also not separate, for example, from other demographic processes. We very often just think about migration and it very nicely fits with the previous speaker, migration flows and migrants. But if you think, for example, ahead, well, Europe is aging rapidly. In the past decades, largest migration streams in Europe were other Europeans. Will this continue to happen in an aging continent, for example? Well, these are things that are not often included. And I think in that sense, the book also shows that we should think out of the box, both in terms of what is included, but also how we want to deal with uncertainty, the levels of uncertainty, and the time window that we think we can say something about. And I think there are really nice examples of that in the book that really trigger thinking, both academically as well as for the policy making.
Thank you. Daniela, can I hand over to you for the next part of the discussion?
Sure, thank you. And Helga's replies is a very good opening for my question, because I'm very curious to hear from you. How can we make the production of scenarios more streamlined? Is it a matter of convincing organizations about their importance? Is it about technical capabilities? And on the same direction, how can their use become more mainstreamed in policy making? What are your thoughts about it? Helga, perhaps you can start as you already started.
Thanks. And well, I also leave it to those who are a bit closer even to policy. I think one of the, we as academics should also convey very clearly the message that we don't have the answer, right? We can provide valuable information and insights, but it's not necessarily that we can predict. I mean, we don't have a glass bowl that we can say, well, you didn't see this, but we see it. Well, we do see some things, and I think we should really convey that message, that we can say something, but we cannot always give the answer to the questions that are currently on the plate. But I think also what our role should be in the dialogue, and probably we speak a bit more about that later on in this conversation, is also to already have this system in place where we look a bit further than just the issues of today, but signal already what is going to happen in the future. And I think their scenarios can help, and also there the dialogue between policy and science would be really enriched if we speak with each other in those kind of words and not just about, I'm facing this issue today, give me the solution and I continue. Because I think that will not be a solution that is going to work also for the future. So I really think this constant exchange about what do we know, what don't we know, what is the horizon to which we can predict, and when do scenarios come in. And I do think they are really adding to the projections, for example. And then we see some tendencies in some countries already where on top of population projections, also scenarios are made. And I think that's a really good way of complementing different types of information to really be prepared in the best possible way. And this holds for both countries of origin and destination. So it's not just on the receiving end, it's also on the countries where people leave, where it's relevant to think about these elements.
Thank you, Helga. Marie, what's your take on that?
My take is probably something is slightly different in that in a policy setting at the national level I'm talking about, the systems are often closed systems. So in my experience, there is a lot of scenario building processes that occur. Often they can be within closed systems, so they only involve civil servants as part of those discussions. But I had the great privilege, really, of running the Irregular Migration Research Program for the Government of Australia. And we ran a high-level strategic dialogue series with the Australian National University and the Department of what it was then, Immigration. And we brought together policy experts, academic researchers, applied researchers, and very senior officials like the heads of agencies, deputies, national security advisors, those sorts of people together to have discussions on different scenarios around very different topics. Wasn't just on irregular migration, although that was one of the key areas of focus. And the hardest thing was getting the right people in the room, to be honest. And the incentive structures around trying to get people to travel to Australia from the other side of the world was a bit challenging to make it worth their while, but also to make sure that Professor Watson didn't stay Professor Watson in the room, took the hat off and really started to engage and started to critically think alongside the policymakers. And I'm really pleased we did a review. We had Ernst & Young do a performance audit of the program, and that was one of the things that came out during the discussions with those people who were involved. That was one of the great successes of that research program. It was a 3-year program because people outside the tent who would normally be outside the tent felt as if they were heard. They were part of the deliberations and the discussions. Their expertise and their knowledge was right in the center at the table with the most senior officials. And that was really gratifying, but it is very difficult to achieve because you have to have a very high level of trust, good communications, and also safeguarding those discussions, which for us, they were off the record discussions. We didn't record them because you're then able to build that trust to have that expertise hit the mark and in a safe environment, which can be very challenging for policymakers because it's so intertwined with politics. So that was kind of one area I think that that really worked. I haven't seen it play out too often, although there are some organizations who are able to do that really well. And it's often behind the scenes where that occurs. But I think what this book does is this book really highlights the importance of scenarios. I love the lessons at the end in the last chapter, the very key points that Jakub makes around, don't focus on numbers except for planning, present future numbers as being very uncertain where you do it. Those really clear and very short and succinct remarks are so incredibly important if you are designing areas of work and initiatives that involve both academic applied researchers and senior officials and policymakers. So that was a very nice ending in the last chapter, I thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. Teddy, I would love to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Well, I mean, we find that the main challenge getting the scenarios out there, getting the right people in the room, like Mary said, and getting the deliverables to land on the right desk. The world is becoming more connected and more complicated. We've touched on that. But correspondingly, it means that the methodologies we need to use to understand the world and migration patterns, these are also becoming much more complicated. And this increasing complexity, not only in the world but also in the methodologies that we're using, I think they carry with them a couple of risks. The first one is that the scenario teams these days, years ago, doing forecasts or scenarios could be done by one or two people, but now the teams are getting bigger because they need to be multidisciplinary. We need to get loads of people on board now to do our work because of the increasing complexity. So just like building a car needs mechanical engineers, physicists, designers, safety, policy experts, now we've got more or less the same situation where if we really want to build a legitimate scenario framework around migration, we find that we need to bring to the table you know, the data scientists, the political scientists, modelers, migration experts, and increasingly conflict analysts as well. You know, given the situation on the border of the European Union right now, getting these teams together, getting the right people in the room, like we heard, is an extreme challenge, whether you're in academia, the private sector, or the public sector. I mean, it doesn't matter. So, I mean, at the EUAA, we've now overseen two really quite large scenario workshops where we invited people to Malta. Maybe a little bit easier to get people there than to Australia, Mary, but still, we had so many organizations in the room, including IOM, UNHCR, you know, many other member states, academia, and we really, you know, subjected those poor participants to a scenario building methodology, and the result was amazing. But you know, the result was nearly as complicated as the processes we were trying to understand. And what was really interesting about those workshops is, you know, what's the definition of an expert? It's someone who knows more and more about less and less. And how interesting it was when you take an expert out of their comfort zone. There can be areas, you know, neighboring their area of expertise where an expert starts to fall over quite quickly. So, you know, we all learned a lot in those workshops. The second thing I'd say is not only that the results can carry with them the complexity, that's also the deliverables that we produce are not always suitable for senior decision makers who themselves might not be very technical, but still they are the ones that need to make the important decisions, you know, whether these are operational or policy decisions. They're making decisions that affect public services well into the future. And Jakub already touched on what we see as being one of the solutions there, and that's this role of data translator. So we've invested in that a little bit to try and find this unique blend of skills, those people that can understand the increasingly complicated methodologies, but can also, you know, really simplify the results in the correct way. They can sit on the fence between the technical forecasting teams and the non-technical decision makers for whom those scenarios are actually designed. And so we really hope that this role of data translator, which we highlight in the book, gets increasing recognition.
Thank you very much, Teddy. And indeed, I mean, I should have credited the idea to you and Konstantinos Melachrinos, because it's all in your chapter in the book, which you kindly contributed as a commentary of from the user's perspective. So can I now ask you the book? I mean, in the book we try to summarize the current state of the art of migration scenario making, forward looking. But now, imagine for a moment that you have the best possible data ever. What do you think, if this was the case, which of these ideas would you find the most promising? What would you think that can give the greatest, not only promise, but the greatest sort of benefits to policymakers, to migrants, to host communities? Or to flip it around, which aspects of migration do you think are worth exploring more so that we gain this knowledge, we gain the data and the understanding? Mary, can I start from you, because I know that you are really interested in these
Sure.
kind of
No, thank you, Jakub. I have a long list actually in terms of the particular areas of migration, but they're kind of in two buckets. One is that, you know, the really difficult areas, the volume might be really low, but the implications, the consequences are very high. So I'm talking here about, you know, like human rights abuses, exploitation, vulnerability, human trafficking, migrant smuggling. You know, those areas in particular would benefit from enhanced data and data translators. I really talk about it in terms of analysis, actually. You know, having someone who's got the quant data skills, but also has the
you can do some work.
I wouldn't say necessarily lived experience for these areas, but understands, the business of migration, has depth of knowledge on the topic as a practitioner or policymaker.
Has the bottle gone down?
And so forth. Conflict, of course, disaster displacement, most definitely. But then on the other side, it's really about the scenarios for regional integration, for example, where we've seen, from Mercosur and CARICOM and Europe, ECOWAS and so forth, those scenarios paint positive potential for migration, particularly in regards to safe, orderly, regular migration. And that's an area I think that would really be enhanced from different scenarios, especially around agency and structure, but also regularization. I mean, regularization as a practitioner perspective, when I was working in Seoul, it was very clear to me that regularization has incredibly powerful benefits that are intergenerational when you engage in large regularization program. And we're also seeing that, of course, in South America, those sorts of areas. And then social inclusion. So integration and social inclusion, and looking at particular metrics over time, whether that's health, whether that's education, whether that's livelihood strategies and employment. So you can actually look at those different scenarios and what it might need to plan and prepare for those going forward. But one interesting insight that I wasn't reflecting on before the event and reading the book, that I wasn't quite prepared for, and this is not in a migration setting. This was at a high-level UN meeting on programming within the UN system. Another agency was talking about the use of scenarios, which we don't have this problem in migration, I must admit, but the use of scenarios with state and non-state actors to invoke action. So these are the scenarios where if you don't do anything, if we don't work on this topic, then the scenario is potentially quite negative. Whereas if we have policy and operational interventions and responses, then we can have a more positive looking scenario. That's not necessarily the case for migration because it's such a high salient topic. And it's on the international agenda, but I found that really interesting. So the use of scenarios to create incentive structures is also quite important in different domains, I would say. Maybe we will get to that in migration at some stage, but I don't think for the foreseeable future there'll be any area that is not trawled over and people are not focused on action.
Thank you very much. Teddy, if you had the best data in the world, what would be the preference? What would be the priority?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I, see the Holy Grail and we have, the ultimate data, I'm, as a practitioner, more thinking about what techniques I would apply rather than the different topics or unanswered questions. And, I think clearly what's knocking at the door right now is the use of artificial intelligence for producing different types of analysis and different types of forecasts and scenarios. We've already seen how some of the large language models can be used to run off-the-shelf forecasting models like ARIMA, for example, but with an additional level of complexity and benefits, I think. So, when you do run an off-the-shelf model as a starting point for any type of forecast or scenario, you can always just say, okay, what would the model forecast based only on the data? The cold, hard data approach, which can then be improved with with other methodologies. When you run one of those off-the-shelf models, the data scientist or the modeler has to put in various parameters into the model, and the more different the parameters are, the different the forecast which is produced. So building these models is very much just as much an art as it is a science. I think this is well known. What we found large language models allow you to do is to produce different forecasts through a range of parameters, and to be saving the results and comparing how successful those forecasts were ultimately. If you use historic data, if you pretend that it's a year ago and you run a whole bunch of forecasts based on historical data, you can then compare the outcome with the actual data, what actually happened. And whereas you might have been stuck there for several weeks running different models with different parameters, comparing with different situations, different demographics, different flows, for example, with some of the large language models, you can ask it to run iteratively different models with different parameters, save the results, give you the result in terms of how accurate the models were, and then what was the most successful set of parameters recently, then apply that to the future. Apply that to the real model that you want to run today to talk about the next 3 months or whatever the time horizon is. So, this is an area that we want to try and be, the thought leaders on. Of course, it comes with some dangers, because talking conversationally with a machine that can do statistical analysis and predictive analytics also comes with risks, because persons who have not gone through the learning process to do it manually can suddenly do it themselves without without the necessary training. And so we would very much say that this should stay within the expert realm. But still, we think that we will be able to support scenario development with much more efficient and much more accurate data forecasts, let's say, and this would be by using artificial intelligence.
Thank you. And Helga, from your point of view, as a researcher, right, as an active researcher, where next?
Well, thanks. Well, I very much agree with the things that have been mentioned already by Mary and Teddy. So I'll probably keep it short, because some of them are also exactly on my list. So it's perfect that we find each other there already in this dialogue. So that's a good sign. What I really think would be wonderful if we have better data, that we can finally move beyond our Euro-centered focus, because I do think a lot of these developments are too much Euro-centered, and actually the action is probably elsewhere in the world rather than in Europe, if I may say so. So I really think that would be a great benefit, because helping understand that also beyond the European case is definitely what is needed, and especially in the future. Another element that also Teddy already touched upon, and I think Marie also mentioned it, we very often now rely on experts. Experts is a nice way, but who is an expert? On what are you an expert? And is the narrowness of certain expertise not too narrow? And don't we need more generalists? So in science, probably we need people who are more generalist as well in the future. But we probably also need different ways of studying this, and not just rely on experts only. AI has been mentioned, that was also on my list. But in the book, we also give a nice example how you can use, for example, more experimental vignette surveys, where you can involve many more people than just consulting a few experts in your scenario building. And I think those would be really the ways forward, where we can hopefully make more differentiated, but also more reliable scenarios that complement further projections of the future.
Thank you, Helga. We are in our last 9 minutes in this meeting, which is very sad news. But I would like to wisely use our last minutes and ask our panelists, what are your last thoughts about this book before I give the floor again to Jakub? What are you taking home with you after this discussion and the insights of the book? Just very short, 1 minute insights. Helga, you can start again if you like.
Sorry, that didn't work. Apologies for it. Yeah, thanks. Well, as a one-liner, I really think what the book shows is that there are so many different aspects to scenario building, and that it's essential to both combine the technological development of these scenario building, but also to combine that constantly, being in touch with both the most up-to-par scientists as the most up-to-par policymakers from the field, because I think our work from the project really showed that this dialogue and having that from the start is really essential if you want to bring things further and also make sure that things that are invented will be implemented. So that's my take of the book, but also of the project. And I think that was a very nice and valuable collaboration in this way.
Thank you, Helga. Teddy?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that this book, I mean, it perfectly, deals with the elephant in the room, and that is that we have the forecasters and the scenario developers on the one side who are rather scientific and celebrate the complexity of the methodology and so forth, and then on the other side we have the policymakers, who are much more comfortable dealing with black and white certainties. So they're living in slightly different worlds with different skill sets, and the scenario developers can often publish new methodologies and sometimes in rather obscure journals, often not aligned with what the policymakers need. The policy might be on where specific type of migration might be needed at a specific time in the policy cycle. And, if the forecasting community, are working on something else, this is far from an optimal way of bringing these two groups of people together. So this is why QuantMid worked, because, it brings everyone into the same room. So we really promote this idea of getting the scenario developers together with the policymakers so that they can share what's required. And what we're passionate about is when policy is developed, when policy is implemented, it needs to contain articles for data collection obligations, so that when the policy is in force, the national authority or whomever it is also collecting the data that has been specifically requested by the forecasters during the dialogue. So then the next generation of forecasts, there should be tailor-made data coming out of the policy implementation, which can be used for the next round of hopefully more accurate forecasts. There's nothing but a win-win situation to get the policymakers and the forecasting community together.
Wonderful. Marie, your last words for us?
Last word. I mean, it's not just the book, it's also the whole process, the QuantMid project, the way of engaging with policymakers, with senior officials, with experts, academics and others, is to have a book on scenarios out of the QuantMid project that talks about humility, that talks about the need for us to recognize that it's not just data, that there's a much bigger picture here. This is much more related to, I think the indigenous kind of learnings, understanding migration processes and migrants especially is rather unusual, to say the least, but extremely welcome and very inspiring, because so often we are, and I think this is becoming much more exacerbated, including with AI. I've just put in an AI blog that's come out today for the forum that I've done. We're getting into areas of increasing focus on digitalization and data, especially quantitative data, and some parts of the house, multinational corporations, yes, I'm including you, in this, are saying that data is going to just pop out the solutions for us all. That it's all about data and it's all about our software and it's our modeling and it's, generative AI tools and so on. That's just dangerous. So it's refreshing, inspiring to read a book out of a QuantMid project that really tries to create a balanced approach, that tries to give tools and advice and recommendations for going down a path that is not just about, the latest data at your fingertips and that's going to give you the solutions. That is not how we need to be working together. That is not about creating effective, sustainable responses and understanding the issues, from societal perspective. So that was my sort of biggest takeaway. It's kind of right the way through the book, but it's also been the process. So again, congratulations to Jakub and the team. It is really inspiring, and this isn't the end, I guess. This is just the beginning in so many ways.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you for all the kind words. I regret that we won't have time for open questions. There was one in the chat which I can tackle, because there was a question about time horizons. So please have a look in the book. We are looking across a range of time horizons that are determined by data availability and by the nature of the process, but all in all, some of the main principles, as discussed, remain the same. So constant updating, learning, and humility. Thank you very much, Mary, for picking that up. So let me just sort of in the five minutes that we have left, just tell you what's in the book, if we have managed to convince you to have a closer look. The book is a relatively short read. It's less than 200 pages. We try to make it accessible in terms of language. There are no formulae or no technical aspects discussed, even though we do try to build on an academic rigor and on analytical rigor. So we start from the foundations, looking at the uncertainty and where does evidence come from. Then we talk about the uncertainty, which is called epistemic, so the one related to imperfect knowledge. Then we talk about uncertainty that is this other kind, the irreducible one, the one about the future. And then we do come back to the question about dialogue and how to translate scenarios into meaningful policies, including commentaries from our esteemed colleagues. So the book is, as was said, the book is open access. I'm pleased to say that as of today, it's available freely to read, download, and share on elgaonline.com, publisher's website. It's accompanied by several analytical tools that we have created as part of the project. So the estimates, the Explorer, the scenarios Explorer, a policy database, and many more. So if you're interested, please visit us on www.quantmic.eu. And if a digital copy is not your thing, we have been, especially on the occasion of this launch, we have been granted by the publisher a 50% discount offer valid until the end of the year. The discount code you see on the screen is BJAK50, slightly changed version of my family name. So if you're interested, please go to the publisher's website. And the final thing I wanted to say, it's really, it's been a huge team effort of many people involved. I hope I've listened. I managed to list everybody on, or at least most of the people who contributed on the screen, to all of whom a huge thank you for all the work, all the inspiration, all the critical comments, and the help with producing the book and with the work that underpins it. And of course, this is a piece of work that has been funded by the European Union's Horizon 2020 program. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for attending. Thank you especially to Mary, Helga, and Teddy, esteemed panelists, for joining us for this occasion to celebrate International Migrants Day by launching this book. And as to echo Mary's words from your final intervention, we do hope that this is a beginning of a longer conversation. So if you're intrigued, if you're inspired, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you very much, and have a lovely rest of the day or rest of the afternoon.